The scissors sliced through the delicate lace, reducing the bride's only wedding dress to a pile of shredded fabric just hours before the ceremony. Carmela stood trembling as her wealthy bridesmaids laughed at the ruin of her thrifted gown. It was a cruel, calculated sabotage meant to cancel the wedding entirely. But those vicious women never could have predicted the convoy of black Range Rovers suddenly pulling up to the venue, nor the imposing royal guards stepping out carrying a garment box bearing the Queen's crest. Rain drummed heavily against the arched windows of the Wentworth estate in Mayfair, casting long, fractured shadows across the opulent drawing room. Carmela Rivera sat on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge, her hands folded tightly in her lap, feeling entirely out of place. The Wentworth family traced their lineage back to the Norman Conquest, their wealth built on generations of shipping empires and real estate holdings across Europe. Carmela, on the other hand, was the daughter of a public school teacher and a retired postal worker. She lived in a modest flat in Camden and spent her days working as an archivist at the Royal Historical Society. To say the Wentworths disapproved of Augustine's choice in a bride would be a catastrophic understatement. Augustine Wentworth, the golden heir to the family fortune, had met Carmela during a charity gala where she was working the registration desk. He had been captivated by her sharp wit, her unpretentious beauty, and the way she didn't care about his last name. They fell in love quickly, deeply, and irrevocably. But while Augustine offered Carmela the world, his family offered her nothing but cold, polished disdain. Nowhere was this hostility more palpable than in the presence of Augustine's younger sister, Brittany Wentworth, and his childhood friend, Victoria Lancaster. The two women had been groomed since birth to marry into high society, and they viewed Carmela not just as an interloper, but as an active insult to their entire way of life. They were entirely opposed to the marriage, and when Augustine insisted that Brittany and Victoria serve as bridesmaids to bridge the gap between the families, Carmela had reluctantly agreed, hoping against hope that the gesture would thaw the ice. It was a terrible mistake. "I simply don't understand why you insisted on that hideous little garment, Carmela," Brittany drawled, swirling a glass of sparkling water. She gestured lazily toward the corner of the room where Carmela's wedding dress hung in a protective canvas bag. It wasn't a designer gown. When the Wentworth matriarch had pointedly refused to contribute a single pound to the wedding preparations, and when Carmela had firmly rejected Augustine's offer to buy her a $50,000 couture piece out of sheer pride, she had taken matters into her own hands. Carmela had spent months scouring vintage boutiques until she found a beautifully preserved 1950s A-line gown made of ivory silk and delicate chantilly lace. It cost her exactly $350. To Carmela, it was a triumph of timeless elegance. To Brittany and Victoria, it was a decarmelation of poverty. "It has character," Carmela said softly, keeping her voice even. "I love the history behind vintage pieces. It feels authentic." Victoria laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that grated on Carmela's nerves. "Authentic? Darling, it looks like something one might find in a theater department's cast-off bin. I am genuinely terrified of what the society photographers will write when they see Augustine standing next to, that." Carmela bit the inside of her cheek, tasting copper. She reminded herself of Augustine's warm smile, of his steadfast promise that once the wedding was over, they would move to a quiet country house in the Cotswolds and leave the toxic high society drama behind. She just had to survive the next 48 hours. What the Wentworths did not know, what no one except Carmela's immediate supervisor knew, was the true nature of Carmela's work at the Royal Historical Society. For the past 2 years, Carmela had been solely responsible for archiving and restoring the private wartime diaries of the late Queen Mother. It was a highly sensitive project requiring absolute discretion. During those long, quiet hours in the subterranean vaults, Carmela had frequently been visited by an unassuming elderly woman wearing a silk headscarf and sensible shoes. It took Carmela 3 visits to realize that the soft-spoken woman asking questions about the diaries was Her Majesty, Queen Eleanor herself. The Queen had taken a profound liking to the young, diligent archivist who treated her not as a sovereign to be feared, but as a grieving daughter seeking connection to her past. Over countless cups of Earl Grey tea in the dusty archives, they had shared quiet conversations about love, duty, and the heavy burdens of family expectations. When Carmela had casually mentioned her upcoming wedding to Augustine Wentworth and the struggles she faced with his aristocratic family, the Queen had listened with a sharp, perceptive glint in her pale blue eyes. "Some people," Queen Eleanor had murmured, tracing the edge of an old photograph, "confuse a heavy purse with a heavy crown. Do not let them dim your light, Carmela." Carmela had kept the interactions completely secret, bound by professional duty and a genuine respect for the monarch's privacy. She certainly hadn't told Brittany or Victoria, who would have immediately weaponized the connection for their own social climbing. "Well," Brittany sighed, standing up and smoothing down her immaculate designer trousers, "I suppose there is nothing to be done about the dress now. The wedding is tomorrow. We shall just have to stand far enough away in the photographs, so the cheap fabric doesn't reflect poorly on our gowns." Carmela remained silent, clutching her hands until her knuckles turned white. Tomorrow she would be Augustine's wife. That was all that mattered. The cheap gown, the cruel bridesmaids, the sneering aristocratic parents, none of it would matter once they said their vows. Or so she thought. Dawn broke over London with a soft, hazy golden light, promising a beautiful afternoon for a wedding. Carmela awoke in the bridal suite of the Grand Savoy Hotel, a luxury Augustin had insisted upon and paid for himself. For a few fleeting moments, staring up at the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling, Carmela allowed herself to feel purely, unadulteratedly free. Today was the day. The peace was shattered precisely at 9 in the morning when Brittany and Victoria swept into the suite, followed by a frantic team of makeup artists and hairstylists. The bridesmaids wore matching silk robes and expressions of barely concealed contempt. "Rise and shine, Cinderella," Victoria chimed, dropping a heavy makeup bag onto the mahogany vanity. "Let's see if we can make you look presentable for the cameras. The paparazzi are already swarming the cathedral steps." Carmela took a deep breath, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, Victoria. Good morning, Brittany." The next few hours were a whirlwind of hairspray, bobby pins, and passive-aggressive comments. Brittany managed to criticize Carmela's complexion, her choice of floral arrangements, and her nail polish color, all under the guise of helpful advice. Carmela deflected it all, keeping her eyes fixed on the canvas garment bag hanging reverently on the antique wardrobe door. Inside was her vintage lace dress, freshly pressed and ready. At exactly noon, the hotel room phone rang. Carmela's mother was downstairs, struggling with a delivery of corsages that the florist had completely botched. "I'll be right back," Carmela said, throwing a hotel robe over her slip. "I just need to go down to the lobby and sort this out. Please don't touch the dress." "We aren't going to touch your precious rags, Carmela," Brittany scoffed, checking her reflection in the mirror. Carmela hurried out of the suite, taking the elevator down to the lobby. It took her nearly 20 minutes to calm her mother down, reorganize the floral arrangements, and authorize the correct payment. Exhausted but relieved, Carmela stepped back into the elevator, checking the time. 1 hour until she needed to leave for the cathedral. It was time to put the dress on. When Carmela pushed open the heavy oak door of the bridal suite, she was met with a deafening silence. The makeup artists and hairstylists were gone. The room was empty, save for Brittany and Victoria, who were standing near the wardrobe. Carmela's heart stopped. The protective canvas bag was unzipped and lying discarded on the plush carpet. And there, draped over a velvet chair, was her dress. Only It wasn't a dress anymore. A massive, jagged tear ripped straight through the delicate chantilly lace bodice, exposing the structural boning underneath. The vintage silk skirt was stained with a massive, dark purple blotch. Red wine, soaking deeply into the ivory fabric, spreading like a bruised storm cloud. But worst of all was the hem. It looked as though someone had taken a pair of heavy shears and ruthlessly hacked away at the bottom, leaving jagged, ruined fringes in place of the delicate scalloped edge. Carmela dropped the room key. It hit the floor with a dull thud. "What happened?" Carmela whispered, her voice entirely devoid of air. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the room blurring as panic seized her chest. Brittany stepped forward, holding a pair of silver tailoring scissors she must have taken from the sewing kit provided by the hotel. Her expression was a masterclass in feigned tragedy. "Carmela, darling, I am so incredibly sorry. It was a complete disaster." "A disaster?" Victoria echoed, holding up a half-empty glass of Merlot. "I tripped. The carpet in here is just terribly uneven. The wine went everywhere. And the lace," Carmela choked out, stepping closer to the ruined garment. Her hands hovered over the destroyed silk, trembling violently. She couldn't touch it. Touching it would make it real. "Well, the wine soaked right through the skirt," Brittany said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I panicked. I thought if I could just cut away the stained portion of the lace, we might be able to salvage it into a shorter dress. But the vintage fabric is just so terribly cheap, Carmela. It practically fell apart in my hands when I tried to trim it, and then the bodice snagged on my diamond bracelet. It's entirely ruined." It was a lie, a blatant, transparent, malicious lie. The cuts were precise, deliberate acts of destruction. They had waited until she left the room, poured the wine, and then hacked the gown to pieces just to ensure she could not wear it. "You destroyed it," Carmela said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes, hot and furious. "You purposely destroyed my wedding dress." "Don't be dramatic, Carmela," Victoria sighed, rolling her eyes. "It was an accident, but really it's a blessing in disguise. You couldn't possibly walk down the aisle in St. Jude's Cathedral wearing that disaster anyway. The Wentworth ancestors would spin in their graves." "What am I supposed to wear?" Carmela cried out, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. The ceremony was in 45 minutes. She was standing in a silk slip. There was no backup dress. There was no time to buy one. Brittany set the scissors down on the vanity with a sharp clack. "Well, I suppose there is only one logical solution. You will have to call Augustin and postpone the wedding. Tell him you had a panic attack. Tell him you aren't ready. We will support whatever excuse you choose, of course." The cruelty of the trap locked perfectly into place. If Carmela went to the cathedral in her slip, she would be institutionalized. If she told Augustin what his sister did, they would deny it, frame her as a hysterical liar, and cause a massive public scandal. The only option they were leaving her was to cancel her own wedding, giving the Wentworth family exactly what they had wanted from the very beginning. Carmela fell to her knees in front of the ruined dress, burying her face in her hands. The deep, agonizing sobs tore from her throat, echoing off the luxurious walls of the suite. She had fought so hard. She had endured their snide remarks, their exclusion, their elitism, all for Augustin. And now they had broken her. "I'll go tell the concierge to ready a car for you to go home," Brittany said smoothly, turning toward the door with a triumphant smirk. "It's for the best, Carmela. You never truly belonged in our world anyway." The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Carmela entirely alone in the sprawling suite. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a judge's gavel, counting down the final minutes of her future. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. It was Augustine. A text message glowing brightly on the screen. "Can't wait to see you at the end of the aisle. I love you forever." Carmela let out a wounded gasp, clutching her chest. She couldn't do it. She couldn't call him and break his heart. But looking at the shredded, wine-soaked ruins of her vintage gown, she knew she had absolutely no choice. She reached for the phone, her fingers slick with cold sweat, preparing to dial his number and end everything. Before she could unlock the screen, a massive commotion erupted in the hallway outside her suite. It wasn't the sound of hotel staff or luggage carts. It was a heavy, synchronized marching, boot heels striking the plush carpet with military precision. Murmured, authoritative voices crackled through radios. Carmela froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered against the heavy oak door. Not waiting for an answer, the door swung open. The hotel manager stumbled into the room, his face completely drained of color, sweat beading on his forehead. "Miss Rivera," he stammered, wringing his hands. I apologize for the intrusion, but..." He was gently but firmly moved aside by a tall, broad-shouldered man in a meticulously tailored dark suit, an earpiece resting discreetly in his left ear. Behind him stepped two towering men in the immaculate scarlet-red tunics and bearskin hats of the Queen's Guard. They took up positions on either side of the doorway, standing at absolute attention, their polished boots gleaming. Carmela scrambled to her feet, instinctively pulling her silk robe tighter around her body, her eyes wide with shock. What is happening?" A fourth man entered the room. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in an impeccable charcoal morning suit, with a small, golden insignia pinned to his lapel. Carmela recognized him instantly. It was Sir Reginald Harrington, the Queen's private equerry and one of the most powerful men in the royal household. "Miss Rivera," Sir Reginald said, bowing his head respectfully. His sharp eyes swept the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on the shredded, wine-stained dress on the chair. A muscle feathered in his jaw, but his expression remained perfectly stoic. "I bring urgent tidings from Her Majesty, Queen Eleanor." Carmela was entirely speechless. She wiped the tears from her raw cheeks, utterly bewildered. "Sir Reginald? How did you know I was here?" "Her Majesty has taken a keen interest in your wedding, Miss Rivera. She dispatched a discreet security detail to the hotel this morning to ensure your day proceeded without interference." Sir Reginald's voice was smooth as glass, but the implication struck Carmela like a thunderbolt. The Queen had known the Wentworths were dangerous. The Queen had been watching. "My dress," Carmela choked out, the humiliation of the situation washing over her again. "They ruined it. My bridesmaids. The wedding, have to cancel it. I have nothing to wear." Sir Reginald offered a warm, remarkably grandfatherly smile. "Her Majesty anticipated that certain aristocratic elements might attempt to force their will upon you today. She was quite adamant that you not be defeated by what she termed petty, new money cruelty." He snapped his fingers. Two more aides entered the room, carrying a massive, antique wooden garment trunk bound in brass. The royal cipher, an ornate golden E, topped with a crown, was stamped onto the polished leather. They set it down gently in the center of the room and stepped back. "Her Majesty requested that I deliver this to you personally," Sir Reginald explained, unlatching the heavy brass locks. "It is from her private collection. A gown commissioned for her late sister, Princess Margaret, in 1955, designed by the legendary Norman Hartnell. It was never worn, kept in the royal vaults for decades. When Her Majesty learned of your affinity for vintage elegance, she had the royal tailors adjust the measurements based on your archival uniform." Carmela's breath hitched in her throat as Sir Reginald opened the trunk and carefully lifted away layers of pristine, acid-free tissue paper. When the gown was finally revealed, Carmela felt her knees weaken. It was a masterpiece of mid-century couture, crafted from luminous pearl-white Duchess satin. The gown featured a breathtaking off-the-shoulder neckline, adorned with thousands of hand-embroidered seed pearls and Swarovski crystals that caught the light like crushed diamonds. The skirt was a voluminous sweeping cascade of silk organza, flowing into a magnificent cathedral train. It was not merely a dress, it was a piece of living history, a garment radiating pure, undeniable power. "The Queen's personal dress?" Carmela whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch the impossibly soft fabric. I can't. Sir Reginald, this is priceless. I couldn't possibly accept this. It is not a gift, Miss Rivera. It is a loan from the Crown, Sir Reginald corrected gently. And Her Majesty insists. She also included a message. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax. Carmela took it with trembling hands, breaking the royal seal. Inside, written in the Queen's familiar, elegant cursive, were only 2 sentences. Hold your head high, Carmela. Let us show them what true royalty looks like. Fresh tears welled in Carmela's eyes, but this time, they were tears of overwhelming gratitude and fierce, reignited determination. She looked at the ruined dress on the chair, then at the breathtaking masterpiece waiting in the trunk. The Wentworths thought they could break her. They thought they held all the power. We have exactly 30 minutes until the ceremony, Sir Reginald noted, glancing at his pocket watch. I have brought Her Majesty's personal dressers to assist you, and if you permit it, Miss Rivera, my men and I will escort you to the cathedral. We wouldn't want you traveling without a proper guard. Carmela stood up taller, her spine straightening as she wiped away the last of her tears. The fear and humiliation that had paralyzed her only moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, unstoppable resolve. Thank you, Sir Reginald, Carmela said, her voice steady and clear. I would be honored. As the royal dressers rushed into the room to help Carmela into the gown of a lifetime, the trap Brittany and Victoria had so carefully laid shattered into a million pieces. They had tried to turn her into a laughing stock. Instead, they had just turned her into a queen. Inside the cavernous, vaulted nave of St. Jude's Cathedral, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of white lilies and the buzzing, eager whispers of London's high society. The pews were packed with members of Parliament, shipping magnates, and aristocrats whose families had dictated the social seasons for centuries. Augustin Wentworth stood at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored mourning suit. But his jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered continuously beneath his ear. The antique cathedral clock chimed 1:15. The ceremony was meant to begin precisely at 1 o'clock. In the front pew, Lady Caroline Wentworth, Augustin's mother, adjusted her diamond brooch with a look of supreme, vindicated satisfaction. She leaned toward her husband, Lord Richard. I told him, she murmured, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding elite to hear. I warned Augustin that girls from her background simply crumble under the pressure of our world. She has clearly fled. A few feet away, Brittany and Victoria slipped gracefully into their designated spots near the altar, acting the part of deeply concerned bridesmaids. They had arrived 10 minutes earlier in a separate town car, putting on a brilliant, tearful performance for Augustin, claiming they had left Carmela in the suite after she suffered a massive, uncontrollable panic attack. We tried to comfort her, Augustin. We truly did, Brittany had whispered, placing a perfectly manicured hand on her brother's arm. She was just rambling about how she didn't belong. She kicked us out. I fear she has already taken a taxi back to her flat. Augustin had shaken his head, his eyes wild with disbelief. No, Carmela wouldn't do that. She wouldn't just leave without calling me. People show their true colors when the heat rises, darling. Lady Caroline had sighed heavily from the front row. Let the priest announce the cancellation. Save us any further embarrassment. Augustin ignored his mother, pulling his phone from his pocket for the 20th time. Nothing. He took a step toward the center aisle, intent on marching straight down, getting into his car and driving to the Savoy himself. Before he could take another step, the low, reverberating drone of heavy engines bled through the thick stone walls of the cathedral. The polite murmurs of the congregation died instantly, replaced by a tense, confused silence. St. Jude's was located on a quiet, restricted-access square. Only permitted vehicles were allowed near the steps. The sound growing louder outside was not a single town car or a lingering taxi. It was the synchronized, heavy rumble of a motorcade. Suddenly, The flashing blue lights of Metropolitan Police outriders painted the cathedral's stained glass windows with a frantic, strobing rhythm. Brittany frowned, exchanging a bewildered glance with Victoria. "What on earth is going on out there?" Victoria hissed under her breath. "Is there a parade?" Augustin didn't wait. He sprinted down the long aisle toward the heavy oak doors of the vestibule, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whispers erupted like wildfire among the guests. Lady Caroline stood up, her composure slipping into blatant irritation, while Brittany followed her brother down the aisle, desperate to ensure her sabotage hadn't somehow unraveled. Augustin threw open the grand cathedral doors just as the motorcade came to a halt. It was not a taxi. 4 imposing pitch-black Range Rovers were parked in a flawless diamond formation at the base of the cathedral steps, flanked by 4 police motorcycles. The vehicles bore no license plates, only the discreet, unmistakable silver crest of the royal household. The paparazzi, who had been lazily waiting by the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of a crying bride, erupted into a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouting voices, completely blindsided by the sudden arrival of a sovereign escort. From the lead vehicle, 4 men in dark suits stepped out simultaneously, their eyes scanning the perimeter with lethal efficiency. But it was the second vehicle that brought the entire congregation, who had now spilled out onto the cathedral steps behind Augustin, to an absolute standstill. The door opened, and out stepped 2 towering figures clad in the scarlet tunics and bearskin caps of the Queen's Guard. They marched precisely to the rear door of the central Range Rover, coming to a sharp, unified halt. Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Victoria's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. "What is this?" Lady Caroline demanded, her voice cracking as she pushed her way to the front of the crowd. "Who ordered a royal detachment?" Then Sir Reginald Harrington stepped out of the vehicle. He adjusted his morning coat, his posture straight as an arrow, and offered his hand to the passenger inside. When Carmela emerged from the shadows of the tinted vehicle, the entire square fell dead silent. The only sound was the frantic, rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters. She did not look like a terrified, ruined commoner. She looked like an empress. The Norman Hartnell vintage gown caught the afternoon sunlight. The thousands of hand-sewn seed pearls and Swarovski crystals blazing with a brilliant, blinding light. The mid-century tailoring cinched her waist perfectly, while the sweeping silk organza skirt cascaded down the stone steps like liquid pearl. The royal dressers had swept her hair into an elegant, timeless chignon, anchoring it with a delicate diamond hairpiece that Sir Reginald had quietly provided from the royal vaults. She was a vision of absolute, untouchable power. Augustin let out a ragged breath, completely paralyzed by the sight of her. He had loved Carmela in her oversized sweaters and messy buns, but the woman standing before him, flanked by the Queen's elite guard, was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. "Carmela," Augustin breathed, stepping forward, entirely forgetting the hundreds of eyes upon them. Sir Reginald held up a gloved hand, gently but firmly halting Augustin's advance. "Patience, Mr. Wentworth," the equerry said with a slight, knowing smile. "The bride must enter properly." Carmela ascended the stone steps, her head held high, the magnificent cathedral train gliding effortlessly behind her. The 2 royal guards flanked her, their heavy boots striking the stone in perfect unison, clearing a wide path through the stunned crowd. As Carmela reached the vestibule, the Wentworth guests scrambled backward, parting like the Red Sea. Aristocrats who had spent the last hour whispering cruelties about her lack of pedigree now bowed their heads instinctively, conditioned by birth to respect the overwhelming display of royal authority. Brittany, however, was entirely paralyzed by panic. She lunged forward, grabbing Carmela's arm as she crossed the threshold into the dimly lit foyer of the cathedral. "What did you do?" Brittany hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. She stared at the blindingly expensive, historically priceless fabric. Where did you get this? You stole it, didn't you? You grifter. You called in some theatrical favor. Before Brittany could finish her venomous accusation, one of the Queen's guards stepped forward, his massive frame completely blocking Brittany from the bride. He did not speak, but the subtle shift of his rifle was enough to make Brittany stumble backward, her eyes wide with shock. Sir Reginald stepped in, his expression perfectly pleasant, but his eyes utterly devoid of warmth. Miss Wentworth, I would advise against manhandling a garment that belongs to Her Majesty's private collection. The Crown takes damage to royal property quite seriously. I trust there will be no accidents with this dress, as there were with the last. Brittany's jaw snapped shut. All the blood rushed from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. The Queen knew. The Crown knew what she had done. If word of her malicious sabotage reached the elite circles she so desperately clawed to remain atop, she would be ruined, socially exiled, uninvited from every gala, every polo match, every royal enclosure at Ascot for the rest of her life. Carmela looked at her soon-to-be sister-in-law, feeling no anger, only a profound, freezing pity. "Take your place at the altar, Brittany," Carmela said softly, her voice echoing with newfound authority. "You are holding up my wedding." Defeated, humiliated, and trembling, Brittany grabbed Victoria's arm, and the two bridesmaids practically sprinted back down the aisle, keeping their eyes glued to the stone floor, desperate to hide from the burning stares of the congregation. In the vestibule, Carmela's father, Thomas Rivera, stood frozen in his rented tuxedo, entirely overwhelmed by the presence of the military guards and the royal equerry. He had been waiting by the doors for 20 minutes, terrified his daughter wasn't coming. "Dad," Carmela smiled, her eyes softening. "I'm sorry I'm late." Thomas wiped a tear from his weathered cheek, stepping forward to offer his arm. You look like a queen, Carmela." Sir Reginald nodded respectfully to Thomas. "Mr. Rivera, it is an honor. Whenever you are ready." The heavy oak doors of the nave swung open once more. The organist, who had been entirely confused by the delay, finally received the signal from the priest. The grand, sweeping chords of the bridal chorus echoed through the soaring arches of St. Jude's. As Carmela and her father stepped into the light of the nave, a collective, audible gasp rippled through the pews. It wasn't just the sheer beauty of the gown. Sitting in the third row was the editor-in-chief of British Vogue, alongside two prominent fashion historians. Carmela saw the exact moment they recognized the dress. Whispers ignited like dry powder. "That's Hartnell. It's Princess Margaret's commissioned gown. The Queen's private vaults. How on earth did she—" Lady Caroline Wentworth was gripping the wooden pew in front of her so tightly, her knuckles were white. Her grand, orchestrated narrative of the weak, poor commoner fleeing in terror was dead. Instead, the woman walking down the aisle was commanding a level of respect and social capital that the Wentworth family had spent 2 centuries trying to buy, only to realize it could never be purchased. Carmela kept her eyes entirely fixed on Augustin. He was crying, silent, happy tears tracked down his cheeks as he watched her approach. When Thomas Rivera finally handed Carmela over to him, Augustin didn't just take her hand. He pulled it to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a fierce, protective reverence. "I thought I lost you," Augustin whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you realized we were all monsters and left." "I would never leave you, Augustin," Carmela whispered back, stepping up to the altar. "But I did have to deal with a few monsters." She cast a fleeting sideways glance at Brittany, who was actively shrinking behind a floral arrangement, looking as though she might be sick. The priest cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles as he looked out over the stunned congregation. Then, at the 2 stoic Queen's guards, who had taken up ceremonial positions at the rear doors of the cathedral. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing in the absolute silence. "We are gathered here today to witness a union of true resilience." As the ceremony unfolded, Carmela felt a deep, radiating warmth spread through her chest. The heavy, oppressive weight of the Wentworth family's judgment had completely vanished. By attempting to strip Carmela of her dignity, Brittany and Victoria had inadvertently handed her the ultimate victory. They had forced Carmela to step into her own power, backed by the quiet, unyielding strength of a monarch who understood that true class had absolutely nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with character. As Augustine slid the gold band onto her finger, Carmela looked down at the shimmering, priceless pearls of the Hartnell gown. It was a shield forged in history, a armor of silk and light. And as the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, the applause that erupted from the pews wasn't just celebratory, it was reverent. They had tried to destroy her, but as Carmela turned to face the congregation, her hand securely in Augustine's, she knew they would never, ever dare to cross her again. Golden chandeliers cast a warm, brilliant glow across the Lancaster ballroom at the Savoy, illuminating a room that had entirely transformed in its collective mood. What was originally intended by the Wentworth family to be a heavily orchestrated display of their own superiority had rapidly devolved into the absolute triumph of the bride they had sought to marginalize. The air was thick with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the frantic, buzzing whispers of London's elite. Word of the royal escort and the origins of the dress had spread through the reception like a wildfire fueled by vintage champagne. The society bloggers and fashion journalists in attendance had already abandoned their plates of seared scallops, furiously typing on their phones. Headlines were already populating the internet. The commoner crowned, Wentworth bride arrives in Princess Margaret's lost masterpiece. Carmela moved through the ballroom with a quiet, grounded grace that left the aristocratic guests entirely disarmed. The Norman Hartnell gown flowed around her like liquid light, the heavy silk organza rippling with every step. She did not gloat, nor did she flaunt the royal connection. She simply smiled warmly, thanked the guests for their attendance, and held Augustine's hand. Her humility contrasted with the staggering priceless piece of royal history she wore only magnified her aura of untouchability. Lady Caroline Wentworth, however, was trapped in a living nightmare of her own making. Desperate to reclaim control of the narrative, Lady Caroline spent the first hour of the reception weaving through the crowds, aggressively attempting to take credit for the magnificent spectacle. Yes, well, we always knew Carmela had a marvelous sense of history, Lady Caroline loudly proclaimed to a circle of wealthy shipping magnates, gripping her champagne flute with white-knuckled desperation. When she approached me about incorporating a vintage element, I utilized our family's extensive connections to ensure she had only the very best. We practically insisted on it. "Is that so, Lady Caroline?" The silky, impeccably polite voice cut through the conversation like a razor blade. Sir Reginald Harrington stepped into the circle, his hands clasped casually behind his back. Though his tone was conversational, the raw power radiating from the Queen's equerry caused the shipping magnates to immediately silence themselves. Taking reverent steps backward, Lady Caroline swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat trailing down her spine. "Sir Reginald, how delightful of you to join the reception. Her Majesty requested that I remain to ensure the gown and the bride suffered no further accidents," Sir Reginald said smoothly, his sharp eyes locking onto Lady Caroline with devastating precision. "It is fascinating to hear of your involvement, Lady Caroline, especially considering Her Majesty personally selected and dispatched the gown only an hour before the ceremony. Specifically because she was informed the Wentworth family had provided absolutely no support to Miss Rivera." The silence in the circle was absolute, deafening, and suffocating. Sir Reginald offered a polite, closed-mouth smile. "I must be returning to the palace shortly. Do enjoy the champagne, Lady Caroline. I hear it is quite adequately chilled." With a crisp nod, Sir Reginald turned and walked away, leaving Lady Caroline drowning in the humiliated stares of her peers. Her lie had been exposed, not by a gossiping socialite, but by the highest representative of the crown in attendance. In a matter of seconds, her social standing had been publicly dismantled. Across the room, entirely unaware of his mother's public execution, Augustin pulled Carmela onto the polished marble dance floor for their first dance. The orchestra began playing a slow, sweeping waltz. As Augustin wrapped his arms around Carmela's waist, carefully avoiding the delicate seed pearls of the bodice, his expression grew incredibly serious. He looked down into her eyes, the joy of the ceremony momentarily replaced by a dark, simmering, protective instinct. "You look breathtaking," Augustin murmured softly, guiding her across the floor. "But Carmela, I am not a fool. You didn't buy this dress in a vintage shop in Soho. Sir Reginald Harrington doesn't deliver dresses to commoners, and the Queen's Guard doesn't run escort for a hotel mix-up. What happened this morning?" Carmela rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. She had debated hiding the truth to preserve the peace, but looking at the man who had stood by her against his entire family, she knew he deserved absolute honesty. "I work for the Royal Historical Society, Augustin," Carmela whispered, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "For the past 2 years, I've been archiving the Queen Mother's private diaries. The Queen. She comes to visit the vault. We've become close." Augustin missed a step, his eyes widening in pure shock. "You are friends with the Queen of England?" "I am her archivist," Carmela corrected gently, with a small smile. "But she knew about the wedding. She knew about your family's objections." "But why the sudden delivery?" Augustin pressed, his brow furrowing. "You had a dress. I saw it hanging in its bag yesterday. You loved that dress." Carmela took a deep, trembling breath, the phantom scent of spilled Merlot rushing back to her memory. "When I stepped out of the bridal suite to handle a florist error, I left Brittany and Victoria alone in the room. When I returned, my dress was destroyed, slashed with tailoring scissors, and soaked in red wine. They told me it was an accident. They told me I had to cancel the wedding because I had nothing to wear." Augustine stopped dancing. Right in the middle of the crowded floor, surrounded by hundreds of gazing eyes, Augustin Wentworth froze. The color drained from his face, swiftly replaced by a terrifying, deeply flushing red. His jaw locked so tightly, Carmela could hear his teeth grinding. The sheer magnitude of his sister's cruelty, the calculated, vicious sabotage meant to destroy the woman he loved, hit him with the force of a freight train. "Augustin?" Carmela asked gently, squeezing his hand. "They ruined your dress," Augustine repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that Carmela had never heard before. "My sister tried to force you to cancel our wedding by destroying your dress." "Augustin, please. It doesn't matter now. Look at what I'm wearing. It's over." "No," Augustin said firmly, his eyes scanning the ballroom until they locked onto his sister. Brittany was cowering near the ice sculpture, nursing a martini, looking everywhere but at the dance floor. "It is absolutely not over." Tension coiled so tightly in the Savoy's private green room that it felt as though the very air might snap. Augustin had marched straight off the dance floor, grabbed the hotel manager, and ordered his parents, Brittany and Victoria, to meet him in the antechamber immediately. Lady Caroline and Lord Richard had arrived, looking deeply irritated, assuming Augustin was going to complain about the floral arrangements or the seating chart. Brittany and Victoria, however, had arrived looking like prisoners marching to the gallows. Carmela stood quietly by the heavy mahogany doors, her hands folded over the shimmering silk of her skirt, watching her husband take command of his family. "Augustin, really? This is highly inappropriate," Lord Richard scoffed, checking his gold pocket watch. "You are missing your own reception. We have members of Parliament waiting to toast you." "They can wait," Augustin snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He turned his furious gaze entirely upon his younger sister. "Brittany, I want you to tell our parents exactly what you did in the bridal suite this morning." Brittany flinched, her eyes darting nervously toward Victoria, who suddenly found the pattern of the wallpaper incredibly fascinating. "I don't know what you mean, Augustin. We helped Carmela get ready. We were wonderful bridesmaids." "Do not lie to me," Augustin roared, the sheer volume of his voice making both of his parents jump in shock. "Tell them what you did to her dress." Lady Caroline frowned, looking between her furious son and her trembling daughter. "Augustine, what on earth is this about? Her dress? She's wearing a museum piece, a frankly ostentatious one, if you ask me." Before Brittany could stammer out another denial, the heavy mahogany doors opened. The hotel manager stepped inside, looking terribly uncomfortable, followed closely by Sir Reginald. In the manager's hands was a large, clear, plastic garment bag. Inside the bag were the ruined, wine-stained, violently shredded remains of Carmela's vintage lace gown. Lady Caroline gasped, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace. Lord Richard's eyes widened in horror. "Upon Her Majesty's specific instructions," Sir Reginald said smoothly, stepping into the room and gesturing to the ruined garment. "I requested the hotel secure this item from the bridal suite. Her Majesty felt it was important that the truth of this morning's events be preserved." Augustin pointed a shaking finger at the shredded lace. "Look at it, Mother. Look at the scissor cuts. Look at the wine." Brittany and Victoria waited until Carmela left the room, and they butchered her wedding dress. They tried to leave her completely naked and humiliated, so she would have no choice but to cancel the wedding. They did it because you taught them that anyone with less money than us is less than human. Lord Richard stared at the jagged, deliberate cuts in the fabric. He was a ruthless businessman, but he was not an idiot. He recognized malice when he saw it, and more importantly, he recognized the catastrophic danger his daughter had just placed the entire family in. "Brittany," Lord Richard said, his voice deadly quiet. "Did you do this?" "It was an accident," Brittany cried out, tears finally spilling down her perfectly contoured cheeks. Victoria tripped. The wine spilled. We tried to cut away the stain to save it, but the fabric was just so cheap, it fell apart. "You are a liar," Augustin said with absolute disgust. He turned to the hotel manager. "Mr. Davies, did your staff find anything else in the room?" The manager swallowed nervously, pulling a small plastic evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a pair of silver tailoring scissors. "We found these on the vanity, sir. They belong to the hotel's emergency alteration kit. The blades are coated in red wine and silk fibers." Victoria let out a small, pathetic sob, stepping away from Brittany. "It was her idea," Victoria blurted out, her loyalty instantly evaporating in the face of ruin. Brittany poured the wine. Brittany cut the dress. "I just watched." "Victoria!" Brittany shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of magenta. "Enough!" Lord Richard bellowed, silencing the room instantly. He turned to his daughter, his expression one of absolute, unadulterated fury. It wasn't just that she had been cruel, it was that she had been caught by the crown. "Do you have any idea what you have done? The Queen's equerry is standing in this room. The monarch herself had to intervene to clean up your mess. If this gets to the press, the Wentworth name will be a laughingstock. Our shares will plummet. We will be blacklisted from every social circle in Europe." Lady Caroline was hyperventilating, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of the situation. She looked at Carmela, not with disdain, but with genuine, unmasked terror. Carmela was no longer the poor archivist they could bully. Carmela was under the direct protection of the sovereign. Carmela held the power to destroy them all with a single sentence to a reporter. "Augustin, please," Lady Caroline begged, stepping forward, her hands outstretched toward her son. "We must keep this quiet. We will pay for the dress. We will pay for whatever Carmela wants. We can manage this." Augustine looked at his mother, then at his sister, his eyes devoid of any familial warmth, the last shred of his attachment to their toxic world severed cleanly, like a final cut of a blade. "You will not pay for anything, Mother," Augustine said coldly, "because you are leaving, right now. Brittany gasped. Augustine, you can't. It's your wedding. You forfeited your right to be at my wedding the second you picked up those scissors, Augustine snarled. You, Victoria, mother and father, you will walk out the back door of this hotel. You will not speak to the press. You will not return to the reception. If anyone asks, you fell ill. And if I ever hear that you have spoken a single disparaging word about my wife again, I will personally ensure this ruined dress and the full story of what you did is leaked to every tabloid in London. Lord Richard knew a losing battle when he saw one. He grabbed his wife's arm with a bruising grip. Come, Caroline. Brittany, Victoria, get your things. Now. Augustine, please, Brittany sobbed, realizing her brother was entirely serious. She was being cast out. Get out, Augustine commanded, turning his back on them. The silence that followed their departure was heavy, leaving only Augustine, Carmela, Sir Reginald, and the terrified hotel manager in the room. Sir Reginald offered a small, approving nod, signaling the manager to leave the bag and exit the room as well. Augustine turned to Carmela, the anger finally draining from his shoulders, leaving him looking exhausted but profoundly relieved. He walked over to her, taking her hands in his. I am so sorry, Carmela, he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I should have protected you better. Carmela reached up, tracing the line of his jaw. She looked at the shredded dress on the table, then down at the shimmering, priceless pearls of the royal gown she wore. You did protect me, Augustine, Carmela said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You chose me, and that was all the protection I ever needed. Sir Reginald cleared his throat softly, a gentle twinkle in his eye. If I may interrupt the romance, Mr. Wentworth, I believe you have several hundred guests waiting to celebrate with a bride who has proven herself quite worthy of her crown. Shall we return? Augustine smiled, offering his arm to Carmela. Yes, Sir Reginald. Let's go show them what real royalty looks like. The remainder of the wedding reception was nothing short of a triumph. With the toxic, suffocating presence of the Wentworth family officially excised from the Savoy, the atmosphere shifted from stiflingly formal to genuinely joyous. Without Lady Caroline there to silently judge every laugh, and without Brittany sneering at the modest background of Carmela's relatives, the two halves of the room finally mingled. Augustine's university friends and colleagues found themselves roaring with laughter at Thomas Rivera's dry, self-deprecating jokes. The editor-in-chief of British Vogue, who had been seated near the back, actually approached Carmela to inspect the impeccable beadwork of the Hartnell gown, completely captivated by the historical significance and Carmela's undeniable poise. When midnight finally struck, Carmela and Augustine departed the Savoy under a shower of white rose petals, stepping into a vintage Rolls-Royce with the quiet, profound realization that they had won. 2 weeks later, the newlyweds returned to London from a quiet, secluded honeymoon in the Italian Alps. Augustine immediately set to work, severing his financial ties to the Wentworth shipping empire. He had his own trust, inherited from his late grandfather who had always despised Lord Richard's ruthlessness, and Augustine used it to establish an independent, philanthropic foundation. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the bloody, cold machinery of his father's legacy. For Carmela, returning to London meant returning to the subterranean vaults of the Royal Historical Society. On her first Tuesday back, the archives were quiet. The scent of old paper and leather bindings was a comforting embrace after the whirlwind of the wedding. Carmela was meticulously cataloging a newly acquired box of correspondence from 1941 when she heard the familiar rhythmic tap of sensible walking shoes against the marble floor. Carmela immediately stood up, smoothing her modest wool skirt. Queen Eleanor walked into the private viewing room, accompanied only by Sir Reginald, who waited discreetly by the heavy mahogany doors. The monarch wore a simple tweed skirt suit and her signature silk headscarf, looking for all the world like an ordinary grandmother dropping by for a visit. But the sharp, perceptive glint in her pale blue eyes belonged entirely to a sovereign, "Your Majesty," Carmela said, dropping into a deep, flawless curtsy. "Oh, do get up, Carmela," the Queen murmured warmly, pulling out a chair at the reading table. "You know I despise unnecessary aerobics before I've had my morning tea." Carmela smiled, rising to her feet and taking the seat across from the monarch. I do not even know where to begin to thank you, Your Majesty. What you did for me, what you saved me from, I will spend the rest of my life trying to repay that kindness." Queen Eleanor waved a gloved hand dismissively. "Nonsense. The Hartnell gown had been sitting in the dark for far too long. Margaret would have been thrilled to see it cause such a spectacular stir. She always did love upstaging the exceedingly arrogant." The Queen paused, her expression turning slightly more serious as she studied Carmela's radiant face. "Sir Reginald informed me of the unpleasantness in the hotel suite and the subsequent dismissal of your new in-laws." "Augustine handled it," Carmela said softly, a deep sense of pride blooming in her chest. "He told them to leave, and they did. We haven't spoken to them since." "Good," the Queen nodded firmly. "People like the Wentworths operate under the delusion that their wealth shields them from consequence. They view cruelty as a spectator sport. It is vital to remind them, occasionally, that there is always a bigger fish in the pond." The monarch reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, leather-bound booklet. She slid it across the table toward Carmela. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Wentworth," the Queen said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "The Victoria and Albert Museum is curating a new, highly exclusive exhibition for the winter season. It is titled Threads of Resilience, a Century of Royal Garments. They have naturally requested several pieces from my private collection." Carmela looked at the booklet, then up at the Queen, slightly confused. "That sounds wonderful, Your Majesty. But how can I help?" "I have decided to loan them the Hartnell gown," Queen Eleanor explained. "But I have stipulated a very specific condition. The gown is not to be displayed alone. It will be the centerpiece of a diorama. I have instructed Sir Reginald to deliver the remains of your original vintage dress, the one those vicious girls took a pair of shears to, directly to the museum curators." Carmela's breath caught in her throat. "My ruined dress? But why?" "Because," the Queen said, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce protectiveness, "we are going to display it exactly as it was left in that hotel room, slashed, stained, and destroyed. And right beside it, bathed in a magnificent spotlight, will be the Hartnell masterpiece. The placard will not mention the Wentworth family by name, of course. We are not crass." The Queen's smile widened into something remarkably cunning. "The placard will simply state that the Hartnell gown was loaned by the Crown to rescue a bride whose original dress was maliciously destroyed by her jealous bridesmaids on the morning of her wedding. We shall let London's high society do the math. They are quite adept at gossiping, after all." Carmela stared at the monarch, utterly astounded by the sheer, devastating brilliance of the move. It was the ultimate checkmate execution of social justice. The Wentworths would never be named, but everyone in their circle would know exactly who the exhibit was about. They would be forced to walk past their own cruelty, immortalized in a national museum under the direct sponsorship of the Queen. "Your Majesty," Carmela breathed, wiping a stray tear of profound gratitude from her eye. "You are truly wicked." Queen Eleanor let out a rare, genuine laugh that echoed brightly through the quiet archives. "One does not sit on the throne for this long without learning how to properly sever a snake's head, my dear. Now put the kettle on. I want to hear everything about Italy." The winter season hit London with a bitter, biting chill, but it was nothing compared to the freezing exile that descended upon the Wentworth family. As Queen Eleanor had perfectly predicted, the opening gala for the Threads of Resilience exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum was the social event of the decade. The entire aristocracy was in attendance, sipping champagne and admiring the historical garments. But when the velvet ropes were finally pulled back to reveal the centerpiece, the collective gasp from the elite could have sucked the oxygen out of the room. There it was, suspended on a beautiful antique dress form, was the violently shredded, wine-soaked, vintage lace gown. The placard below it detailed the vicious sabotage by wealthy, malicious bridesmaids, contrasted immediately by the towering, radiant majesty of the Norman Hartnell gown right beside it. The rumor mill did not just spin, it exploded. It took less than 48 hours for Victoria Lancaster to crack under the intense scrutiny. Desperate to salvage her own social standing and terrified that the royal household might banish her family from the upcoming Ascot season, Victoria leaked the entire truth to an anonymous society blogger. She threw Britney entirely under the bus, claiming she had been held hostage by Britney's psychotic jealousy and had begged her not to cut the dress. The fallout was biblical. Britney Wentworth was immediately and ruthlessly excommunicated from high society. Invitations to galas, charity balls, and exclusive club memberships vanished overnight. When she attempted to show her face at a high-profile equestrian event, the other women literally turned their backs to her, forming a silent, impenetrable wall of rejection. Unable to handle the crushing humiliation of being a pariah, Britney fled London, moving into a drafty, isolated hunting lodge on a minor estate in the Scottish Highlands, far away from the cameras and the whispers. Lady Caroline fared no better. She was quietly but firmly asked to step down from her positions on 3 major philanthropic boards. Her friends stopped returning her phone calls. The narrative she had spent her life cultivating, that the Wentworths were untouchable, had been shattered by a single, silent museum exhibit. Lord Richard, furious at the damage done to the family's reputation, practically cut off his wife's limitless credit lines, blaming her for raising a daughter foolish enough to cross the crown. Meanwhile, miles away from the venomous snake pit of London's elite, Carmela and Augustin were building a life that looked nothing like the one his parents had intended for him. They had purchased a beautiful, rambling stone manor in the Cotswolds, surrounded by acres of wild lavender and ancient oak trees. Augustin's philanthropic foundation had become a massive success, focusing on providing grants and educational resources to underprivileged historical societies across the United Kingdom. He worked passionately, free from the dark shadow of his father's corporate tyranny. Carmela continued her work for the Royal Historical Society, though she was now permitted to work remotely from her sunlit study in the country. She commuted to London only twice a month to visit the archives and to have tea with her favorite patron. On a warm afternoon in late May, near their first wedding anniversary, Carmela sat on the stone patio of their Cotswolds home, watching Augustin chase their newly adopted golden retriever puppy across the expansive back lawn. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and fresh rain. Augustin scooped up the tumbling puppy and jogged back toward the patio, his face flushed, wearing an old, faded university sweatshirt and muddy boots. He looked nothing like the rigid, tightly wound, aristocratic heir she had met 3 years ago. He looked free. He dropped into the wrought iron chair next to her, stealing a sip of her iced tea. "You know, I received a letter from my father's solicitors today," Augustine mentioned casually, scratching the puppy behind the ears. Carmela paused, her pen hovering over the archival manuscript she was reviewing. "Oh, is everything all right?" "Perfectly fine," Augustine smiled, leaning over to kiss her cheek. "Apparently, Mother tried to host a spring garden party, and out of 200 invited guests, only 14 RSVP'd. My father is threatening to sell the Mayfair estate and move to Monaco to escape the embarrassment." Carmela looked out over their peaceful, sun-drenched garden. A year ago, the thought of the Wentworth family's wrath would have sent a spike of terror through her chest. Now, it felt like reading a news article about strangers in a distant country. "Do you feel sorry for them?" Carmela asked softly. Augustin looked at his wife. He saw the woman who had stood trembling but unbroken in a ruined hotel room, the woman who had walked down the aisle of a cathedral, wearing a piece of history, commanding the respect of thousands without ever raising her voice. "No," Augustin said firmly, taking her hand and threading his fingers through hers. "They built a prison of their own arrogance, and they locked themselves inside it. We built a home." Carmela smiled, squeezing his hand as a warm summer breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oaks above them. The scissors had meant to destroy her, to cut her out of the narrative entirely. But instead, they had merely severed the heavy, toxic strings that had threatened to hold Augustine back, freeing them both to write their own glorious history. What a satisfying ending to an unbelievable true story of resilience and royal intervention. If you loved seeing Carmela overcome her toxic bridesmaids and watching the Queen deliver the ultimate karmic justice, make sure to hit that like button right now. It really helps support the channel. Share this video with anyone who loves a good revenge story or needs a reminder that true class has nothing to do with money. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done to the bridesmaids?